Please be seated. Good morning. Blessed day that it is to be at Ascension. You're instituted as rector, and you just hope folks keep showing up. So it's a good sign. We glad to have Father Ernie as celebrant this morning. It's important to have different voices leading our worship to make sure that we catch the fullness of the liturgy that we gather with each week. And in fact, it's a great week to be at Ascension because we started our Sunday school this morning too. Many of you were here, engaged in one of the classes or the offerings that are happening with the youth, the children, the adults. All have different classes. But I think it's also worth noting that our worship is our principal formation experience. It is the building block on which all of those other offerings are made, and it is the thing that unites us as a community as we gather for worship. It is what we hold in common. So it's a good and blessed thing to be here together to worship, and an opportunity for us to engage with the Scriptures. Now I'll say it is a delight. We're thoroughly enjoying living due to being in Texas, and the family has settled in well. One thing that we missed while we were in Hawaii and still haven't really had a chance to delve back into is road trips. Now, I say road trip is kind of I don't know if it's an American classic or if it's very American, whatever it is, the road trip. The notion where you can get in your car and drive not for 1 day or 2 days, but, well, maybe not 20, but for a long time in one direction. And I think it is something probably pretty much every American family has participated in at some point along the way. I know that growing up, we went on many road trips, or as my parents like to, I don't know if there was a lot of sarcasm on this, but it was like happy family trips. I think the more teenage my sisters got, that's now an adjective, the more teenage my sisters got, the more sarcasm that was probably coded on that phrase, a happy family trip. But I still have a lot of fond memories of the trips that we took. And indeed, my wife and I have been on some road trips together, and I've been on road trips with a couple other friends, and something happens when you spend those extended periods of time in a car together that cannot ever happen on a shorter ride, even a commute, even if you're commuting partners with somebody and you regularly have an hour or so a day together. Something different happens when you settle in for a long haul, and it affords an opportunity for another depth or another level of conversation that doesn't exist on the shorter trip and doesn't necessarily exist in a living room because, hey, you're trapped, right? I mean, there's not much you can do to get away from the people you're with on a road trip. And I was good friends with a guy in high school, but we didn't really get to know each other until the end of high school. Derek Prell was his name, but we went on a couple of road trips together, and we're still friends. And I think maybe that notion of that, what instills in a road trip and that bonding that happens, we stay in touch still, and I think part of it's because even though we went to college like 150 miles away from each other, we'd get together and we'd go on a long trip together occasionally. And one time, Sarah, Derek, and I were on a long road trip, and after so many hours, or even I think we were like a day and a half into a drive. We were going maybe out west to go skiing. Was one of the big trips we took, and you kind of get in that road weary trance almost, right? You're just kind of there. We weren't having deep conversations, and Derek let out a big sneeze. And we were so absorbed in the road and road weary that we didn't even say bless you. And I think it was after the second sneeze, he looked at us like, really? And he looked at us, he goes, thanks, guys. And we said, oh, sorry, bless you. He said, thanks now, But for whatever reason, that little joke has stayed with us. And occasionally, with Sarah and I, if one of us sneezes and nobody notices, we look and thanks, guys, and we remember that moment that was hilarious in the car and not nearly as funny now. Truly. But we all have those moments, and I have to think that when we read repeatedly in the Gospels about the journeys from town to town, village to village, as Jesus and his disciples walked along, they must have had many more moments that aren't captured in the Gospel. Probably lots of "thanks, guys" kind of moments, and lots of little jokes that reside with them, through their time together. And also, Jesus kind of capitalizes on this time, this sacred time, where we're not encumbered by crowds. We're not engaged in healing somebody. He's not teaching in the capacity that he's got to when he's got the masses before him, but just those who draw near and are his disciples are present. And it affords him an opportunity, I believe, to go deeper and offer insights and knowledge that the other gatherings won't have the option to receive from Jesus. And it's in one of those really sacred moments when it's just Jesus and the disciples and they're passing through Galilee, trying to not be noticed by the crowd so that they might have some time. Because we're really at a turning point in the whole gospel story where he starts to move away from big public teaching. We're more than halfway through this Gospel of Mark. Soon they'll be heading towards Jerusalem, and he's trying to prepare them for what is going to happen. And so for the second time in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to suffer at the hands of others. He's going to die. This is a lot to absorb even in a sacred moment just among those he loves and trusts. And it notes that they're confused by this. Even though it's the second time they've heard it, they don't understand it, and they're afraid to ask. This is something we could probably all relate to. Maybe they're afraid to ask because they think they ought to know the answer. Maybe they're afraid to ask because they suspect they know what the answer is and they don't want to hear it. Maybe they're afraid to ask to be ridiculed by the other disciples. But instead, they kind of take their road-weary trance and just keep moving and don't respond to the question or the statement that Jesus offers them. Instead, they argue among themselves about who's greatest. Now, this does make a certain amount of sense. I mean, Jesus doesn't stop them. He kind of lets them kind of huddle and argue as they go along. After all, if Jesus is really going to die and really going to be gone, they need to know who's greatest. They need to know who's going to be in charge. They need to have an understanding of who's going to carry forward this movement that's begun. Because that, my friends, is how they've understood everything from all time, that someone has to be in charge. And they expected a Messiah who would lead in that same kind of capacity. They expected a Messiah who would be kingly. They expected a Messiah who would overthrow the Roman oppression that was burdensome to them. They expected a Messiah who would be very different than Jesus. So rather than contemplate the question that was probably on their hearts, they argue about who's greatest among them. Now, if I had to speculate about what question was on their hearts, it's one that rests with us still. It's why? Why does Jesus have to die? Now, it takes, perhaps, being instituted as rector to be able to talk about this not in the Lenten season. But I think the question that rests heavy on the disciples' hearts and in our own from time to time is why? Why does Jesus have to die? My friends, I believe that Jesus has to die so that we might begin to understand that the transformational power of God's love is stronger than the sword. That God's transformational love is stronger than a gun. That the power of God is stronger than a kingdom. that the power of God is bigger than any one nation or country, that the power of God is bigger than a leadership style or a way of being. And I think that's what he's trying to instill in them when he's trying to shift their entire understanding of the way things are. He says, listen, when you're arguing about who's going to be first, whoever's going to be first, you should try to be last. He's trying to upend their understanding and their thinking so that they might understand that it's not about the notion of power as they've understood it, because there's something far more powerful than all of the things that they've experienced power through before, and that's the power of God's love. Amen. Yeah. It's the power of God's love that Jesus is trying to convey to them in this very heavy moment as they walk along the road. The power of God's love is still bigger than all of those things. And the power of God's love resides in each of us. The call by Christ towards God's love and for us to be an expression of it is the chief cornerstone of the gospel message. And I believe it is the ultimate answer as to the big question that rests within us as why? Why did Jesus have to die? So that we might understand the overwhelming nature of God's love. Amen.